Welcome, everybody, to this, the 284th CACOR live session. Some of you, the ones of you who are in Ottawa, you're probably experiencing some freezing rain today. And this brings me back to 1998 when we had the ice storm in Ottawa that caused lots of damage, and especially with our electrical infrastructure. And you remember probably that Ottawa at one point, because our transmission lines are so far from the source of electricity, they were damaged, and we were on the point of having a blackout. So it's interesting in the context of what the provincial government wants to do in terms of doubling down on more centralized power that's in effect really brittle. So today we have Jack Gibbons, and he's been the chair of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance since 1997. And in the past, he's been a project manager for the Ontario Energy Board and a Toronto Hydro Commissioner. So he studied economics at University of Toronto, Queen's, and also UBC. In summary, Jack will examine the government of Ontario's plans to meet 75% of Ontario's electricity needs with nuclear energy by 2050. And we'll also talk about what would be the lower cost alternatives.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And it's great to have the opportunity to talk with people today about how we can and should meet Ontario's future electricity needs. But first, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. The Ontario Clean Air Alliance was established in 1997 to promote the phase out of Ontario's 5 dirty coal-fired power plants. And we worked on that campaign every day for 17 years until the last coal plant was shut down in 2014. And now we're working on the next step to clean up our electricity grid, namely the phase out of our gas-fired power plants. And we believe that we can phase out gas power and lower our electricity bills by investing in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and energy storage. Now, the good news is that most of the world is moving to a renewable electricity future. In 2014, more than 90% of the world's new electricity supply was renewable, mostly solar and wind. But here in Ontario, our Premier Doug Ford hasn't contracted for a single kilowatt hour of wind or solar electricity since he was elected in 2018. And as a result, he has had to ramp up our gas-fired power plants to keep our lights on. Now, back in 2017, when Kathleen Wynne was Premier of Ontario, gas was used to produce only 4% of our electricity. But by 2024, we were using gas to produce more than 16% of our electricity, and it is now forecast by the government that gas will provide a quarter of our electricity in 2030. So we are going in the wrong direction. More gas burning means more smog, and it means more climate damage. And also, more gas burning is a threat to our national security, since more than 70% of Ontario's fossil gas is imported from the United States. But the key feature of Doug Ford's electricity plant is a huge spending spree on high-cost nuclear energy. And last November, the Ontario Energy Board was forced to raise residential electricity rates by 29% because of the rising cost of nuclear energy. And as people may know, in Ontario, there is a taxpayer subsidy to lower residential electricity bills. And that taxpayer subsidy used to be equal to 13.1% of the total bill. But when the Ontario Energy Board raised the rates by 29% in November, at the same time, Doug Ford increased the Ontario electricity rebate to 23.5%. And he did that to mitigate most of the bill increase from the 29% rate increase. And so that means that now in Ontario, about a quarter of the cost of a residential homeowner's bill is paid for not by the homeowner, but by all of Ontario's taxpayers. And this subsidy is a taxpayer subsidy is now costing Ontario about $8.5 billion a year. And that's equivalent to more than 50% of Ontario's provincial deficit. And I believe that most people who are listening today would agree that there are better ways to spend our tax dollars. Now, to add insult to injury, uh, Ontario Power Generation, or OPG, is now applying to the Ontario Energy Board for permission to increase its price of nuclear energy by 72.6% next year. And it's told the Ontario Energy Board that it needs this price increase to pay for the Darlington refurbishment cost overruns and also to pay for new nuclear projects. Now, this slide shows Doug Ford's proposed four new nuclear power projects. And there's three key features I'd like to highlight about these projects. First, they're absolutely massive. The total generation capacity of these nuclear projects is 18,200 megawatts. That's equivalent to 75% of Ontario's peak day electricity demand. So a massive expansion of new nuclear generation capacity. The second important feature to note is that these projects are very expensive. In total, they will cost about $400 billion, and this will push our electricity rates through the roof. And the third key feature about these projects is that they were not selected by a competitive procurement process. Instead, for the first two projects, the Darlington New Nuclear and the Pickering B Rebuild project, these projects are going ahead as a result of backroom sweetheart deals between the Government of Ontario and OPG. With respect to the third project, the proposed Port Hope nuclear station, the government is planning to enable that project by another sweetheart backroom deal between OPG and the Government of Ontario. And with respect to the fourth project, new nuclear reactors in Bruce County, the government is proposing to finance that project by a sweetheart backroom deal between the Government of Ontario and Bruce Power. So really important to realize that these are all being driven by backroom deals, not by a competitive procurement process that will get our supply at the lowest possible cost to ratepayers. Now, if all of Doug Ford's nuclear projects proceed, then by 2050, 75% of Ontario's electricity will be produced by nuclear energy. And that's a huge ramp up. In 2024, only 48.5% of our electricity was produced by nuclear power. And this huge ramp up in nuclear electricity does not make sense since we've got much lower cost and quicker options to meet our future electricity needs. Now, this slide compares the costs of Ontario's electricity options. And on the far right-hand side, you can see the cost of new nuclear in terms of cents per kilowatt hour. And so the nuclear option is very high cost. It's up to 10 times more expensive than energy efficiency. and it's 2 to 8 times more expensive than wind or solar power. And in fact, the bar graph on the right that shows the cost of nuclear power, it actually understates the total cost of nuclear power because it does not include the cost of decommissioning the reactors at the end of their life, and it does not include the cost of storing their radioactive nuclear waste for 1 million years. So if we pursue the nuclear option, our electricity rates are going to rise dramatically. But if we actually want to lower electricity bills for Ontario's families and industries, then we need to invest in the lower cost options, namely energy efficiency and wind and solar power. Now, when talking about the cost of nuclear energy, you have to talk about cost overruns because every single nuclear project in Ontario's history has gone over budget. Uh, in the in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, Ontario Hydro built the Pickering, the Bruce, and the Darlington nuclear stations. And all of these projects went massively over budget. And as a result, by 1999, Ontario Hydro was virtually bankrupt. And therefore, the government of Ontario made the decision to break up Ontario Hydro into 5 new corporations. And one of those corporations was Ontario Power Generation, or OPG. And it got the nuclear assets. But it didn't get the nuclear debt because the government knew if OPG also had to pay the nuclear debt, it wouldn't be profitable. So instead of transferring the nuclear debt along with the nuclear generating stations to OPG, the, gov- the government transferred $20.9 billion of nuclear debt to the Ontario Electricity Financial Corporation to pay off. And many of you may remember for years on your monthly electricity bill, there was a nuclear debt retirement charge. And it's also important to note that the Darlington refurbishment project, which was started in 2016, has also gone over budget. In December, OPG told the Ontario Energy Board that it will have to spend another $3.3 billion to be able to continue to operate the Darlington nuclear station safely until 2055. So a big cost overrun. But despite this very embarrassing fact, our Minister of Energy, Stephen Lecce, put out a press release last month falsely stating that the Darlington refurbishment project had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Well, this press release from Minister Lecce was just false news. Ontario Power Generation has told the Ontario Energy Board that the Darlington refurbishment project will be at least $3 billion over budget and it will be late. And it's not just in Ontario that nuclear projects go over budget. On a global basis, on average, nuclear projects have cost overruns of 120%. On the other hand, the average cost overruns for solar and wind projects are 1% and 13% respectively. Now, we all know that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And these facts have been used by the nuclear industry for years to claim that wind and solar cannot provide us with reliable 24/7 electricity to replace the need for nuclear power. This is a claim they've made for years. But Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator issued a report last August that refutes the claims of the nuclear industry. According to the IESO report, when wind and solar are combined with batteries, they can provide us with reliable electricity for at least 99.5% of our electricity needs. The remaining less than 1% of our electricity needs could be met by our existing gas-fired power plants or by shifting some demand from peak to off-peak periods. So a really important finding, we don't need to build new nuclear to keep our lights on. And the IESO report had another key finding. Not only can wind and solar and batteries provide us with reliable electricity, but they can do it at a lower cost than building new nuclear reactors. And in terms of meeting our peak power needs, the IESO report says that wind and solar and batteries can do it at an 80 to 84% lower cost. And with respect to base load needs, the IESO report says wind and solar and batteries can meet our electricity needs at a 14 to 29% lower cost than new nuclear. Now, there's some important facts to know about the IESO report. The IESO's analysis was based on four very optimistic assumptions about the costs and performance of new nuclear reactors. And as a result of these overly optimistic assumptions, the IESO's report has actually underestimated the cost savings that we can achieve by investing in wind and solar and batteries instead of much higher cost nuclear power. And so I want to just highlight these four key pro-nuclear assumptions of the IESO report. And these are pro-nuclear assumptions that are not supported by the facts, not supported by Ontario's historical experience. The IESO's first pro-nuclear assumptions for their analysis was that these new nuclear reactors would operate with an annual capacity utilization rate of about 91%. But in fact, historically, Ontario's nuclear reactors have had an average capacity utilization rates of less than 80%, not greater than 90%. The IESO's second assumption was that new nuclear reactors will be able to operate for 60 years without a major refurbishment. But in fact, none of Ontario's nuclear reactors have been able to operate for that length of time without a major refurbishment. Take, for example, the Darlington nuclear station. Its major refurbishment started in 2016, which was just 26 years after its first reactor came online. Third, the IESO's report assumes that new nuclear reactors will cost about $11,000 to $16,000 per kilowatt capital cost. But in fact, the most recent nuclear reactors to be brought into service in the United States, they had a cost of greater than $22,000 per kilowatt. And finally, the IESO's analysis ignored the costs of decommissioning the nuclear reactors and storing their radioactive nuclear waste for 1 million years. But even so, despite the fact that the IESO's analysis was based on four very pro-nuclear assumptions that aren't supported by the facts, nevertheless, its analysis found that wind and solar and batteries can meet our electricity needs at a lower cost than new nuclear reactors. Next, I'd like to turn to the issue of timing. One of the benefits of wind and solar is they can be built a much quicker than new nuclear reactors. For example, OPG is hoping to build a giant nuclear station at Port Hope. And according to OPG, under a best case scenario, the first reactor would come into service in 2040, and the station would be complete in 2048. But that's more than 20 years to complete the nuclear station. On the other hand, wind and solar facilities can be built in 6 to 24 months. So wind and solar are much quicker options to meet our future electricity needs and to phase out our gas-fired power plants. And then there's also the important issue of national security. OPG is now building new American-designed nuclear reactors at Darlington. And both OPG and Bruce Power are considering building American-designed nuclear reactors in Port Hope and Bruce County. Now, these American reactors uh, would require us to import enriched uranium from the United States to fuel them. And that's a national security risk because these imports of enriched uranium could be cut off at a moment's notice by the President of the United States. So much better from a national security point of view to be investing in wind and solar that are powered for free by wind blowing in wind or sun in Ontario. And the good news is that we have a huge untapped wind and solar potential here in Ontario. For example, Great Lakes offshore wind power alone could meet more than 100% of our electricity needs. And it could do it with a very small lake bed footprint. For example, we would need about 3,100 wind turbines to produce as much power as the proposed Port Hope nuclear station. But the lake bed footprint of these wind turbines will be less than 1/3 of a square kilometer. And now we know that some people don't like looking at wind turbines, but if they were 10 to 15 kilometers offshore, they would be almost invisible. And we also have a large solar potential in Ontario. Solar farms with a footprint of only 0.4% of Ontario's land area could also supply 100% of our electricity needs. And in urban areas, there is also a huge potential for rooftop solar and large parking lot solar. For example, in the city of Toronto, rooftop and large parking lot solar could meet more than 50% of the city's electricity needs. Now, unfortunately, back in 2011, Premier Dalton McGuinty imposed a moratorium on Great Lakes offshore wind power. And according to Premier McGuinty's press release, the moratorium was necessary to permit further scientific research. Well, after the press release was issued, the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources did do some more scientific research, and they concluded that offshore wind power could be implemented with minimal adverse aquatic impacts. But the main environmental concern about wind power is its impact on birds and bats. And so it's important to note that according to the National Audubon Society, two-thirds of our North America's bird species will face extinction unless we tackle climate change. And as a result, the Audubon Society supports uh, the environmentally responsible siting and operation of Great Lakes offshore wind turbines. And according to Professor Christina Davy of Carleton University, it's bats that are the species that are most vulnerable to offshore wind turbines. And therefore, she recommends that the wind turbines should be turned off from dusk to dawn during the migratory bat seasons when wind speeds are less than 7 meters per second, because bats fly more often when wind speeds are low. So we believe that it makes sense to permit environmentally responsible Great Lakes wind power to help phase out our gas-fired power plants and to lower our electricity bills. Now, as we've noted, wind and solar must be combined with energy storage to provide us with reliable 24/7 electricity. And the good news is that we have numerous storage options. And at the moment, the most popular storage option are stationary lithium-ion batteries. And for example, the government of Ontario has procured more than 2,000 megawatts of lithium-ion batteries. But there are also other storage options. For example, compressed air, and a local Toronto company, HydroStore, is developing compressed air storage projects in California and Australia, and they would also like to develop compressed air storage projects in Ontario. Hydro-Quebec's reservoirs are another good option for storing surplus wind and solar power. And according to an MIT study, they are our lowest cost storage option since they're already built. Now, one storage option that absolutely does not make sense is TC Energy's proposed Meaford pump storage project. This project would use electricity to pump water from Georgian Bay uphill at night to a reservoir, and then it would be released during the day to produce electricity. But this is a very high cost project. And it's not just me who's saying it, but it's the IESO. The IESO has analyzed this project and it told the government that the project was not economic, that we have lower cost options like lithium ion batteries. And that should have been the end of it. But nevertheless, despite the fact that the IESO told Minister Stephen Lecce that this project is not good for ratepayers, he last year directed the IESO to provide TC Energy with $285 million of electricity consumers' money to finance TC Energy's cost of doing more detailed cost analysis of its proposal and for doing an environmental assessment of this project. And that's just wrong. It's a waste of ratepayers' money. But it's another example of the Ford government making sweetheart backroom deals with large energy companies that are not in the best interest of Ontario's hardworking families and Ontario's industries. And instead of providing TC Energy with $285 million to further for pre-development work for an uneconomic storage project, instead, the government of Ontario should be aggressively promoting the option of using our electric vehicle batteries to provide storage for our electricity grid. When our EV batteries are combined with bidirectional chargers, they can store surplus wind and solar energy and provide it back to the grid when it's needed. And this is an option with a huge cost-effective potential for the following reasons. First, by 2040, it's estimated that the total storage capacity of our EV's batteries will be about 3 times greater than Ontario's peak electricity demand. And since cars are parked for 95% of the hours of the day on average, that means there's this huge capacity that can be used to provide power back to the grid. So this has got huge potential. And since the batteries are already paid for, this should be a relatively low cost storage option for our electricity grid. And the good news is this option is already being pursued in other countries. In the UK and in France, uh, people with EVs are provided with free EV charging if they will allow their EV batteries to be used to provide power back to the grid when it's needed. So now I'd like to tell you our 8-point plan to actually lower our electricity bills. So the first thing to do is cancel Doug Ford's high-cost nuclear projects. Second, don't we should not be procuring new gas-fired electricity generation. Third, there should be no more backroom sweetheart deals with large companies like OPG, Bruce Power, and TC Energy. Fourth, we should rescind the moratorium on Great Lakes offshore wind power. Fifth, we should expand our transmission links with Manitoba and Quebec to enable us to import more wind, water, and solar power from Manitoba, Quebec, Labrador, and Nova Scotia. For example, in Nova Scotia, the Premier of Nova Scotia wants to develop offshore wind power off the coast of Nova Scotia. This project is called Wind West, and according to the Premier of Nova Scotia, this project could produce electricity electricity supply equivalent to 27% of Canada's total electricity consumption today. So huge potential. He would like to develop that project with the assistance of the government of Canada and export power west to Ontario. So we need to expand our transmission links to enable us to import more low-cost wind, water, and solar power from our neighboring provinces. And then we need to start procuring wind, water, and solar power plus energy storage via competitive procurement processes so that we can get the lowest cost. We can get this clean electricity at the lowest possible cost. And these procurements should be open to all Canadian renewable energy and storage companies. For example, the government of Ontario has a procurement process that's going on right now to procure new supplies. But these procurements are limited to companies who have generating facilities in Ontario. And that's not good for ratepayers. We should also be procuring wind, water, or solar power from our neighboring provinces if they can provide it to us at a lower cost. And also, we need to establish a standard offer price for the purchase of rooftop and parking lot solar. Now, a competitive procurement process is the best way to get renewable power from large power developers at the lowest possible cost. But it is just too complicated and complex for the average homeowner or the average church or the average Canadian Tire store to enter into a competitive procurement process to pay for rooftop solar. So, in order to simplify things and to facilitate small-scale rooftop and parking lot solar projects, the government needs to establish a standard offer price. That is, it needs to say, if you have rooftop solar, then for every kilowatt hour, we'll pay you a certain price per kilowatt hour. For example, it might be 15 cents. So the government says, if you put rooftop solar on your roof, then if you export power to the grid, you get 15 cents for every kilowatt hour of solar power you provide to the grid. And as long as this standard offer price is less than the cost of a new nuclear reactor, then this procedure, not only will it bring more renewable power onto our grid, but it will also lower our electricity rates by reducing the need for much higher cost new nuclear. And finally, we should pay EV owners to provide power back to the grid when it's needed. The Ford government is paying large battery storage companies to provide power back to the grid, and it should also provide EV owners for providing power back to the grid. Again, this will be good for the EV owners. It will be a new income stream that would help pay for their electric vehicles, and it would also be a low-cost source of storage for the grid and therefore help reduce everyone's electricity bill. Now, as some of you will recall, Premier Ford was elected in 2018 on a promise to reduce our electricity rates by 12%. By 12%. But he never kept that promise. In fact, electricity rates have continued to rise while he's being in power. So that raises the question, why isn't he adopting our 8-point plan to actually lower electricity rates? He claims he wants to lower electricity rates for Ontario's hardworking families. Why is he not doing that? Well, I think we can answer that question by asking who benefits from Doug Ford's high-cost nuclear and gas-fired electricity policies. And the answer is our four largest energy utilities and Cameco. Now let's look at these companies. OPG and Bruce Power, they are our two largest electric utilities. They produce more than 80% of our electricity. They obviously are benefiting from Doug Ford's nuclear policies. Then there's TC Energy. TC Energy owns 48% of Bruce Power. TC Energy is the proponent of the uneconomic Meaford pump storage project that is receiving a $285 million handout from Ontario's electricity consumers. Enbridge Gas is Ontario's largest gas distribution utility, and Doug Ford's decision to ramp up the Oakwood gas plants is increasing their profits. And then there's Cameco. Cameco is Canada's largest uranium mining and refining company, and it also owns 49% of Westinghouse, an American nuclear power company. So clearly, we're up against five very powerful and politically well-connected companies. But nevertheless, rising electricity rates are not good for Ontario's hardworking families, and they're not good for Ontario's industries. Therefore, I believe that by working together, we can move Ontario towards a renewable electricity grid and lower electricity bills. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them.
Okay, great, Jack. Thanks very much for a very good presentation. So, if you could stop sharing your screen, and what we'll ask people is, as you are called upon to ask your question, if you could show your video. And as the host, I get the privilege of asking the first question. So, uh, my question is, so I follow the energy space quite a bit, and what I've seen is that in Europe, and we see that in the UK in particular, where they have an issue in the UK where electricity prices are actually tied to the price of natural gas because of the way their markets are structured, but they have high electricity costs, right? And what we're seeing in Europe and in the UK is industries that require lots of electricity. They are they're moving to locations where electricity is much cheaper, right? So my question is, what do you see as the impact on the rest of the industry in Ontario? As the price of electricity increase with more nuclear.
Well, absolutely. That's one of the major reasons why Doug Ford's a nuclear plan doesn't make sense. They're going to lead to increasingly high electricity rates, which will drive industries out of Ontario. We need to encourage industries to locate in Ontario. And if we want to do that, we have to invest in wind and solar electricity, which are the options that can actually lower our electricity rates. As we saw in the slide at the beginning of my presentation, in most of the rest of the world is going to renewables. And we're going to have to go renewables too if we want to keep our, if we want to lower our electricity rates and to attract industries to Ontario and to create and protect jobs in Ontario. So, Doug Ford has running full page ads in in Ontario newspapers saying that his pro-nuclear policies are protecting Ontario. But in fact, they're doing the exact opposite. They're pushing up on our electricity rates, which make it less attractive for industries to locate or stay in Ontario, and that's threatening the long-term prosperity of Ontario's industries. So, what he's doing, it benefits five well-connected energy companies, but for the rest of Ontario's industries and for Ontario's families, it's very bad news.
Yeah, actually, I remember when the press releases happened for the two large battery plants that are operating or under construction in Ontario. One of the things they said was they came here because of the cheap, clean electricity that we have. So hopefully we could keep on having cheap, clean electricity. So we'll start with Paul Beckwith. And Paul, you have a whole bunch of questions. If you could stick to the first two for now, and then we'll come back to you. And then Guy Brodsky, you'll be on deck for the next question after that. So Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Fantastic presentation. Um, I just we don't have to reinvent the wheel with solar and wind and stuff. I mean, China's doing remarkable things, as most people are aware. And they're going to electrify their entire country by 2050 is their plan, by wind, solar storage, and so I guess, how do we? It seems like Ford and his actions to push through nuclear. It's almost like a cartel, or it's almost like a mafia or something. So I guess how do we break that? I mean, included in that is the cost. Like, what kind of accountants do the costs for a new nuclear plant? When we know that they're over budget so much, like it seems completely ludicrous and illegal that they can get away with these cost overruns being so huge for every project, as you mentioned. And my other question is, what are there, what is to stop a community, a city, for example, talking directly to China, bypassing the Ontario government, the federal government, and saying, we want, your wind and solar and batteries and completely get off the grid for our community. Can you help us do it? Because they go to Africa, for example, and they can do that, in a city or a region, and people welcome it. So, is it possible to do that here? Probably not. I mean, we can't even get their electric cars. Well, we have 50,000 of them coming in, but so what are some of the hurdles to stopping a community doing that here? Like saying to heck with Ford, to heck with other governments. Let's just get this in our community.
Well, here in Toronto, we're trying to encourage Toronto Hydro to build a Lake Ontario wind farm to help us phase out the Portland's gas-fired power plant on Toronto's waterfront. And Prime Minister Carney has set up a major projects office to finance and expedite projects that are deemed to be in the national interest. And so we're hoping that Toronto Hydro and Toronto City Council will support a Lake Ontario wind project and will ask Prime Minister Carney's major projects office to help expedite its approval and its financing and its construction. So that's one thing. And also there's a huge potential, for rooftop solar. And in Toronto, for example, down the street where I live from, for example, the Loblaw store has solar panels on its roof. The Canadian Tire store has solar panels on its roof. Local churches, local laundromats have solar panels on their roof. Those are great shining examples. But there are many, many huge rooftops in Toronto that don't have solar panels. So again, we're asking for the City of Toronto and Toronto Hydro to show leadership and work with, big box retailers like Costco and Loblaws and Home Depot to get solar panels on all their roofs to help us phase out the Portland's gas plant and give us a cleaner and more secure electricity supply.
Great answer. And actually, I think there's a bit of an issue with the OEB and the if you produce more electricity than you need, then it goes free to the grid, right? So that's a bit of a limitation for large deployments on large roofs, correct?
Yeah, absolutely, Raymond. It's absolutely nuts. But if you produce more solar power than you can consume in your local building or home on an annual basis, then all the excess power that you supply to the grid, you get nothing for it. You get no financial compensation. And that's just absolutely wrong. And it's another example of how the system is biased in favor of these large privileged corporations like OPG and Bruce Power. They're paid for every single kilowatt hour that they deliver to the grid. And similarly, Ontario's families, Canadian Tire stores, local churches should be paid for every single kilowatt hour of solar electricity they provide to the grid. But the Doug Ford government refuses to do that. And it's bad for ratepayers, and it's bad for our climate, and it's bad for public health. It doesn't make sense, but there's all these rules that are biased in favor of nuclear and gas power and are working to undermine the development of cleaner renewables and wind power.
Thanks for that answer. So we'll have Vlad on deck, but Guy Brodsky, you're next.
Thanks. Yeah, great presentation. I just wanted to say quickly before my question, I just threw a link into the chat. One possible other barrier to just filling up all the rooftops in Toronto with solar is that there has to be capacity on the local distribution grid. The OEB just recently mandated that all utilities provide public capacity info, and they've now centralized it into a really cool map that you can look at. So highly encourage looking at the link just to see where locally there might actually be capacity and where there just might not be. I worked in solar sales for a couple summers during the feed-in tariff program. And I remember sometimes by the end of it, by the later years, like some neighborhoods just didn't have like hosting capacity for new solar. So even if someone was interested, they just couldn't fit it essentially. But yeah, so my first question was just where you got or what ISO report was the one that showed that you could meet full demand with just wind, solar, and batteries, and at a lower cost than nuclear, or what the assumptions kind of were that went into that.
Yes, well, it's a report that they released quietly in August of last year. And if you go to the Ontario Clean Air Alliance website and you click on our publications page, you can scroll down to a report, a briefing note that we released in September excuse me, of last year that summarizes this IESO report.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks. So Peter McKinnon, you have a comment there, and I think you may want to voice it, not as a question, but as a comment. But so Vlad, you're next.
Thank you, Jack, for this great presentation. I believe current levels of energy consumption and demand cannot be sustained from a materials requirements perspective, even if we do a full transition to a green energy, including for our industrial capacity, which, by the way, I think it's impossible with current tech because we cannot make steel or concrete or fertilizers or plastics without fossil fuels. So this means concerted planned degrowth. And my question is, Canadians are in a massive electricity overconsumption pattern vis-a-vis their global fair share of ecological footprint. So what do you think would be a just pathway to degrow the electricity personal and industrial consumption levels for Ontarians and Canadians? Thank you.
Yes, well, you're right. We are wasteful in our consumption of electricity. We could be much more energy efficient, and energy efficiency is the lowest cost way to meet our electricity needs. And so, for example, the government of Ontario does have electricity efficiency programs, but for electricity efficiency investments, they only pay on average 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And so that's like that could be only like 1/10 the cost of new nuclear energy. So what we're saying is the government of Ontario should ramp up its energy efficiency programs and be willing to pay the same amount to save a kilowatt hour that it pays for new electricity supply. And if you really pursued energy efficiency, if you just pursued all the energy efficiency that is cost effective, there'll be huge reductions in demand.
Okay, thanks a lot. So Peter, and after that, David Pollock.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. And Jack, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I found it had some biases in it, which made me think about certain challenges as well. So that was interesting in that respect. One of the issues about nuclear power that I think that Doug Ford has and his advisors have got kind of screwed up, if I can use that term. I posted in the chat, so I'll just read it for the benefit of the conversation here. A big issue, in my view, with respect to Ford's nuclear program is he wants to create electricity to generate residential, industrial, etc. heat. when in fact nuclear plants produce enormous amounts of heat, in other words, waste heat, and that could be fed into large-scale district heating. And in fact, I paraphrase now, but there are actually some people on this call that or this webinar that have actually done the thermodynamics of what I'm about to say. In that regard, that the heat from from Pickering nuclear power plant, if put into a large scale district heating, 100 up to 100 kilometer type diameter, you could actually heat virtually all the buildings in metropolitan Toronto. And because you would not use steam, you'd use hot water. You could also put heat into the water, as in for cooling in this cooling season. I mean, there's an extra cost involved there. It's a local transformation from in terms of refrigeration. Anyway, that's just a comment I wanted to make, and some others on here on the calls who've been involved in a study that I also posted a link to a study that was produced in World Nuclear News on a project that we were involved in looking at this issue in Ontario and in particular also in Canada, because we're very late in the game in Europe, particularly Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, China. They have all embraced this type of large-scale district heating by various sources. I mean, biomass can be a heating source as well, but many of them are also using nuclear power, the waste heat. In fact, there's one reactor, a Canadian CANDU reactor in the Shanghai complex. There's four, I think, reactors in the complex near Shanghai, and one of them is actually used for district heating, as well as electricity, of course. Anyway, that's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, well,
Okay,
that's a
thank you.
very interesting comment. And certainly, you're talking about transporting hot water from Pickering to downtown Toronto. I think that would be quite an expensive project, but certainly worth looking at and comparing it. I mean, alternatively, the downtown Toronto buildings could be heated by geothermal from ground sources. And for example, the U of T has
Yes.
recently implemented a large geothermal project. So I think what you want to do is compare the cost of local geothermal to your hot water pipe all the way from Pickering, and it would be interesting to compare them and see which is most cost effective.
One of the other interesting implications is that this could be in my view, a transition means for the gas distributors. Now, the piping will be different, but the big thing is that the gas distribution system has got the right of ways, and they've got the right of ways to virtually every building. That's worth, well over $1 trillion right there.
Yeah, sometimes those little details really get in the way. So, Richard made a comment about the fact that Fukushima was exactly 15 years ago today. So, I made a comment also. There's a book that was written by Ramana. The title is "Nuclear is Not the Solution: The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change." Very good book. I read it. It talks in a lot more detail about what Jack covered, but it also goes further than that in terms of looking at the implications of enriching uranium and those issues. So after David, we'll have Paul Beckwith again. You have actually a question on uranium enrichment. So David?
Good. Thank you, Jack. Nice to see you. The question I have is, over the years, you've had a lot of back and forth with the Ontario government. Presumably, they've got access to the same kind of material that's in the slides you presented to us today. And presumably also, if a Ford government wanted to have sweetheart backroom deals with renewable companies, they could do that. And I'm trying to get a handle on your understanding of why there's so much resistance to changing gears when you apply the analysis that you've applied. Do they challenge it on the basis that it's factually incorrect? Or what do you think this resistance is from? Thanks.
Well, good question. I mean, change is always difficult. It's always easier to stick with what you've always done. But I think the main barrier is that there are these very large and well-connected companies who are in the nuclear business, and what Doug Ford is doing is very good for them. I mean, like like the facts I'm using, like for example, the IESO report, the
Yeah,
Independent Electricity System Operator, that's an agency of the government of Ontario.
yeah,
And their job is their official mission is to meet our electric to keep our lights on at the lowest possible cost. And they put out this report that shows that wind and solar and batteries are actually a lower cost option. But Doug Ford and Minister Lecce don't want to go that way. And I mean, it's partly also reflects the fact that, Doug Ford was elected in 2018 on an anti-wind and solar campaign. And so maybe he feels that would make it embarrassing for him to now become pro wind and solar. But I mean, I think there's a good justification for that. I mean, he was concerned about the McGuinty government's wind and solar policies, which paid high prices for wind and solar. But during the last 10 years, the cost of wind and solar and batteries have gone down dramatically.
yeah.
So, reality has changed. Wind and solar and batteries are now our lowest cost options to keep our lights on. Reasonable people could think otherwise in the past. So, we're always trying to win them over, but we haven't done so yet. And we're also trying to, but people want lower electricity rates, and if we can get the message out to the public and convince them that wind and solar are lower cost, then they will demand it, and the opposition leaders will start demanding it. But at the moment, Doug Ford is resisting it, and he's buying all these newspaper ads and radio ads and ads in movie theaters, claiming that new nuclear is needed to protect Ontario. But in fact, it's doing the exact opposite. It's raising our electricity bills and making Ontario's industries less competitive. So I think all these ads indicate that he's feeling some pressure to reverse course.
Hmm. Thank you for that. And Raymond, somewhere down the line, Martin Green was challenging the presentation. I don't know if Martin has a question, but if not, I'd like you to look at that because he was saying that some of the maintenance issues push the cost up much higher than nuclear to move into renewable. So at some point, I'd like to hear from Martin to get that kind of dynamic or dialogue going. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions, but Martin, if you could do it fast,
Okay, I'll try and keep it quick. The challenge with renewables, wind and solar, is that they are intermittent. And the wind can suddenly drop or can suddenly increase, and the same with the sun. Clouds show up and your solar power goes way down. The power system needs reliable power. And if the supply goes away suddenly, then that has an effect on the frequency that power gets distributed. So normal equipment has got rotating machinery, great big turbines that are rotating, and that the inertia of those turbines keeps the power system going. You don't get that from wind and solar. And this is a serious problem. And there was a major outage that people have seen in Spain and Portugal this year that happened because they had too much reliance on renewable power, primarily solar in that case. And so they lost their whole power system. And they could only bring it back up because they had reliable power available from a connection to France with its nuclear generating stations. So they would have a very difficult time recovering their power system if they didn't have that big rotating machinery to provide stable power, that they could gradually add the renewables back onto the power system. Power systems are really complex. It's not so simple.
Well, I certainly agree that power systems are very complex, but I would also point out to you that it's not just me who's saying this, but but it's the independent electricity system operator that runs our electricity grid. And they put out a report and they analyzed it and they said that wind and solar, when combined with lithium ion batteries, can meet 99.5% of our electricity needs.
Well,
So
actually, I'm familiar with that report, Jack, and they didn't do that for the entire power system. They
So,
said the existing supply that we've got
so
can be
Martin,
maintained. Sorry.
we'll go to someone else. Okay.
Yeah.
I've seen reports from the incident in Portugal and Spain that said that it had nothing to do with the renewables. It had to do with the way they were being operated. So, Paul, you're up. And then after that, not sure who's next. Art will be next.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to address Martin's comments a little bit. We've got an entire country of what, 1.4 billion people that's going to electrify their entire grid by 2050. You know, China is an engineering state, right? The US is a lawyerly society. Canada's not quite as bad as the US, but we're there. We do policies based on nonsense, based on non-engineering, non-science things. But my question is to Jack, why on earth would we go for enriched uranium reactors? There's only a few places in the world that do the enrichment, and it's a nuclear proliferation issue. I think, is there more than one place in the US that does the enrichment? And how enriched is the uranium? And why can't we just generate it? Can it be generated in breeder reactors as well? Is it another question?
yes, well, that's a very good question. Why are we importing U.S. reactors, which require enriched uranium? You know, for years we had our CANDU reactors, which are fueled by natural uranium. And for years we were told by our nuclear industry that the CANDU nuclear reactors were the best reactors in the world. But then OPG made the decision for their new nuclear station at Darlington not to go with the CANDU reactors, but instead to go with the American GE Hitachi reactor. So, you know, I don't really know why OPG did that, but I guess they thought that it was a better design than the CANDU reactors. But it requires enriched uranium. And, you know, maybe when they made that decision to go with enriched uranium, maybe they weren't thinking of President Trump. But, you know, we're now living in an age where I think most Canadians realize we have to reduce our dependence on the United States. And so to be building new American reactors that will require us to constantly, every day, import enriched uranium from the United States to operate them just doesn't make sense from a national security point of view. I mean, it doesn't make sense from an economic point of view either, because wind and solar are a lot cheaper. But yeah, it really is mind-boggling. Again, when you look at Doug Ford's advertisements that appear in the paper every day about his policies being about protecting Ontario, but he's increasing our dependence on American energy imports to keep our lights on. It just doesn't make sense.
So Jack, on that topic, there was a bit of a discussion in the chat there. My understanding is Russia is the other supplier of enriched uranium. Someone said that France is also another supplier, but are there any other countries that could supply enriched uranium to us?
Well, I think Russia and France and the United States are the two major sources. Obviously, we shouldn't be buying it from Russia.
Yeah.
And whether France has much capability to increase their enriched uranium exports, I don't know.
Okay, thanks. So, Pamela, you're on deck with your question about PM Carney, and Art, you're next.
Yeah, I I have been running, as you know, for 9 years, a microgrid, and I do sell some of my excess energy to the grid through the via IESO rules, but I get energy credits. I do not get dollars. and I can save these energy credits up, through the summer into the winter when my solar arrays are covered in snow and I'm not getting any. So that's just a nuance on what you said. I also want to inquire why you didn't mention microgrids or virtual power plants. I know that they are extremely popular in Texas, California, New York, and other U.S. states, as well as in Europe. And clearly they have not been approved and are not going forward in Ontario. Do you have anything to say on the use of microgrids and virtual power plants?
Yeah, well, good comments, Art. But just first to respond about your solar panel. Yes, so you're a net metering a customer. And so when you export power, you get a credit, which can be used to pay for power in the winter when your panels are covered with snow. But under that system, and that's a step in the right direction, but under that system, if you made net on an annual basis, if you made net exports to the grid, you wouldn't be paid for your net exports. And that's the problem. And in terms of microgrids, well, yes, of course, they're wonderful. And, microgrids and combined with storage it can help, build a more resilient grid and keep the lights on in their local area, even if there's a problem with a larger a centralized grid. So yes, totally support that too. But just in my presentation, I didn't have time to talk about everything.
Okay, thank you. Good answer.
So Pamela, you're next, and then Charlie, if you want to go after, you have two questions there about the cost of electricity and using gas plants. So Pamela?
Yeah, just a quick question. You see these media reports with Doug Ford and Carney. I'm just wondering why the PM Carney is such a strong supporter of nuclear in Ontario or in Canada in general.
Well, that's a very good question. If you read his book of values, and he is an economist, if you read his book Values, you see that he uses virtually the same cost statistics that we do. His book shows that wind and solar are much lower cost than nuclear. So yes, it's surprising and disappointing that he's using taxpayer funds to invest $2 billion in the building of new U.S. nuclear reactors at Darlington. So why does he do it? Well, I don't know really, but maybe he wants to get Doug Ford to be an ally for him to fight other battles. So maybe he thinks that it makes sense to get Doug Ford on side. But yeah, I don't know. It doesn't make economic sense, and it's Mark Carney is a very good economist, and he knows better.
Thanks for your comments and thanks for the presentation, Jack. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. My pleasure.
So after Charlie will be Richard. So Charlie, you have a few questions?
Well, I think it's stupid to turn off your gas plant. Keep it for meeting demand, because you talked about some gas plant that was, I don't know, in Toronto or something. Keep it, but just use it for the intermittency. And I think I agree very much with Meg on the ground heat thing. And if you're interested in that, I know a guy in the U.S. who's in Ohio who's in the business of building them and has built many of them, and they work well. And apparently, anywhere in the U.S., I don't know if Canada's is it colder underground in Canada too, but I doubt it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that the ground source is a new player in the game. I've got 32 panels on my roof, and in the warmer 6 months or brighter 6 months, I send electricity to the grid. So over a year, I produce about 1 1/3 or 1.5 times more electricity than we use. Um, but I don't think I'm 82. I don't think I'm going to live long enough to get my money back because the electricity is cheap here in Oregon because we kill the salmon to make cheap electricity. Um, so it's a bit complicated, but I think we got to explore more of this ground stuff. And Jack, if you want to just email me and I'll put you in touch with a guy who's really into it. My email is chall@esf.edu, or you just send it to Ray. He knows me.
Well, yeah, Charles, absolutely agree with you that geothermal is a great way for heating homes and buildings. It's the most environmentally benign way.
No, but it's good for making electricity too, according to my friend.
Well,
Okay.
I'm not sure that it's cost effective in Ontario relative to wind and solar. Mark Jacobson, did a paper on geothermal electricity, and he
Yeah.
did mention that in Eastern Canada was not a especially good region for geothermal for electricity, but geothermal is great in Ontario for heating homes and buildings. And as I mentioned, the University of Toronto, right here in Toronto, has a huge geothermal system. This is heating their buildings. And and we're well aware about geothermal. We actually put out a report on the financial and climate benefits of geothermal for home heating. So you
Good.
don't have to persuade me about geothermal.
I agree with you. I don't think we need to go nuclear. I think it's stupid. And I wish you luck. I think your presentation laid out the facts very well. And I just add geothermal to the less toxic options, I think. Now, incidentally, an issue that was not discussed that we need to pay more attention to is something called penetration. That what it's easy to put in 10% of renewable, but once you get over 10 or 20%, meeting the unreliability of solar, it grows as a problem. The more you do. So I think what makes the most sense is to do it incrementally and learn. Because just as you need new capacity or as you need to replace old capacity, and have a plan according to pretty much how you laid it out.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Just don't
That's how
do it
we're
at
going to do
once.
it. We're going to do it incrementally, and we're not just, and we're also proposing to create an east-west electricity grid. So we've got access to water. Our two neighboring provinces, Manitoba and Quebec, get like over 95% of their electricity from water power. So we need to have better access to that. And we need to have access to Hydro-Quebec's huge reservoirs, which are a great source of storage. And also, Labrador is hydroelectric, and there's this wind potential in Nova Scotia. So yes, we need to pursue multiple options. And the good news is that in Ontario, we already get about 25% of our electricity from water power. So what we're talking about is a mixture of wind, water, solar, and energy storage, and also energy efficiency.
Okay, so thank you. Richard, you're next, and then I've
Okay,
got some
thank you.
questions.
That was a good presentation, Jack. It falls in line very much with the publication that actually a couple of colleagues, Jeff Strong and Senator Rosa Galvez, put in the Hill Times a couple of weeks ago. It's been published a few times, and if you want a copy of it, I've posted in the CACOR. But if you need it, then you can send it an email to me. Raymond can put you in touch with my email. I'll send you a copy of it. But the
Yeah,
other thing
no,
I wanted to know is,
absolutely.
have you looked at waste energy transfer as a source of power? In other words, using sewage as a source. I mean, Toronto Western Hospital does it, other places do it, other hospitals have done it, and it's a very effective and it's continuous. There's no you know, any rhythm to it in terms of it sometimes on and sometimes off. It's always there. Sewage is always there.
Yeah, absolutely. It totally makes sense. And in downtown Toronto, we do have this big district energy network.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And tidal power is, of course, another source of energy as well that we haven't really talked about today. But I mean, it's another thing that could be added into your, you know, your
Right.
presentation. I think
Yeah.
overall, I loved your presentation. It was great. Thank you.
Well,
Yeah,
thanks so much.
I think when it comes to tidal power, the issue there is making it economically. There's a lot of projects that are using tidal power and trying to develop that, but there's issues with putting you know, something made out of steel in salt water under terrible conditions, right? So there's real engineering challenges with that. Now, I want to go back to something actually that Charlie mentioned, but we didn't really answer. The cost of power in Ontario. So consumers in Ontario, if you net it out with all of the funny money that the 8.5 billion, I think you said per year
Right.
that's used, right? So what's the, do you know approximately what the average cost per kilowatt hour is for the consumers?
No, not off the top of my head. I can't give you that number.
Okay. So,
But you know, there's a very good publication by Hydro Quebec. It comes out every year. They compare, you know, residential and industrial commercial electricity bills in various cities across Canada and the United States. And it always shows that, you know, Montreal's prices are the lowest, much lower than Toronto's. But, you know, if people are looking for those average cost statistics, that's a good place to look.
okay, thanks, Charlie. I'll tell you what I found out. So I did a computation a couple of years ago and looked at the average with every fee applied to it, and it was around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So I think though the real cost is somewhat higher than that because of these hidden subsidies that we have. But it's you know, we're one of the lowest priced. We have some of the lowest priced electricity in North America. We tend to compare ourselves to Quebec, but the problem is Quebec has the lowest prices in North America because of all their hydropower, right? So we still have pretty low prices. Question I have, Jack, is you mentioned a bit Jacobson, and I know he's done a lot of modeling about how much storage is required and you know, how much solar and wind we need to be able to you know, provide the electricity we need. And he's done that for different regions. I don't know if he's done it for Ontario, but have you seen anything like that that shows what the possible options are?
Well, yes, he's done very good analysis uh, to show how, you know, how the world can move to 100% wind, solar, and water power. But no, I'm not aware of him doing a study specifically for Ontario.
Okay, so I know he's done some for New England, which has similar climate. So, yeah, and it turns out that we're among the least lucky, if I could put it that way, locations because of the low insulation in the winter and all that. But he has modeling that shows that it could be done anyways, and he's got cost models for that and all that. So, pretty interesting stuff to look up if people are interested in that topic. So. So now I guess we'll go to Ted. Ted will provide final comments and a thank you on behalf of CACOR.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Jack. That was most interesting. And those of us who live in Ontario are paying attention to every word. But what really struck me, I thought I was going to come and learn about power, the wrong kind of power. We learned totally about political power, about individual power, about people who want to control the management of what I get and what everyone gets. It doesn't have all that much to do about the science, about power formation, about power sharing. It has to do with the personal power of a prime minister or the head of a nuclear industry, just the same as it does out west when we're talking about fossil fuel power. So it's I think a different perspective, and this is one of the few panels around that you can actually talk about these kinds of things together. You stimulated a lot of very interesting ideas and very good questions, so I would like to thank you again for another very stimulating presentation. We try to do this every week, and we usually win, and we think we did today. So thank you very much. So I would ask you, those of you who have not paid your membership, what a good time to do that. Use the dividends from your use of solar power. It would be a very good use of that money. So thank you again for coming. We'll be putting it on again next week. And please join the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. Invite your friends. We can always use a few more people. And those of you who are just here for the first or second time, please join us. And right on our website, there is a place where you can simply mail us your interest. And if you really wish, mail us money. So thank you very much and have yourselves a great week.